The ruins of hope. The settlement was dead. What had once been a thriving colony was now a graveyard of shattered metal and burning debris. Smoke hung thick in the air, turning the sky into a dull, choking haze. Kale moved cautiously through the wreckage, his rifle raised, his boots crunching over broken glass and twisted scraps of ruined infrastructure. The acrid stench of scorched earth and destruction clung to everything, seeping into his armor, into his lungs. The familiar scent of war. Signs of life were few: scattered belongings, abandoned tools, blood smeared across a collapsed barricade. But no bodies. That was worse. Raiders didn't leave bodies behind. Not intact. His grip on the rifle tightened as he scanned the ruins. He'd seen this before, knew how it played out. First, the bombardment to force colonists into hiding. Then, the ground assault, sweeping through homes, dragging survivors into the streets. Those who resisted were cut down. The rest, well, the rest were never seen again. A sound cut through the distant crackle of fire, a child's cry. Kale froze, his body reacting before his mind did, shifting into a battle-ready stance, his senses sharpening. The cry had been faint, but close. He adjusted his position, weaving through the rubble toward the source. He found them in the open courtyard of what had once been the settlement's central hub. A woman stood in the center of the wreckage, her iridescent blue-violet skin streaked with dirt and blood. Her long silver hair was unbound and wild in the smoke-filled air. She was holding her ground in front of two children, shielding them with her body as a group of raiders surrounded her. She was outnumbered, unarmed, and backed against the crumbling foundation of a collapsed structure. The children, both young, their small frames trembling, clung to the fabric of her tattered cloak, their wide amber eyes darting between their mother and the raiders, silent but terrified. One of the raiders, a brute of a man with patchwork armor stained with old blood, stepped forward, a cruel grin splitting his scarred face. "Pretty thing like you," he drawled, his voice thick with amusement. "You got two little ones to feed, huh? Tough luck. Ain't much food left here." The woman said nothing, her gaze locked onto him, calculating. The raider chuckled, nudging the man beside him. "Maybe we take her with us. Sell her off. Could fetch a good price." Kale's finger tightened on the trigger of his rifle. He didn't like getting involved. Survival in this galaxy meant keeping your head down, staying out of trouble. But this was different. He couldn't just walk away. He stepped out from the shadows, his rifle aimed at the raiders. "Leave her alone." The raiders turned, their weapons raised. The leader sneered. Well. Looks like we got ourselves a hero. You sure you want to do this, boy?" Kale didn't respond. He fired a shot, hitting the leader square in the chest. The man crumpled to the ground, his eyes wide with shock. The other raiders hesitated, their confidence wavering. Kale took advantage of their confusion, firing again and again, driving them back. The woman didn't waste any time. She grabbed the children and ran, her movements quick and purposeful. Kale covered her retreat, his shots precise and deadly. Within moments, the raiders were either dead or fleeing, their bravado shattered. Kale lowered his rifle, his chest heaving. The woman stopped a few feet away, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. "Kale," he replied, his voice steady. "And you?" "Leora," she said, her golden eyes studying him. "Thank you. But you shouldn't have done that. They'll come back. And next time, they won't stop until they have me." Kale frowned. "Why? What do they want with you?" Leora hesitated, her fingers brushing against a small, glowing pendant around her neck. "It's complicated. But if they catch me, it won't just be my life at stake. It'll be the entire galaxy." Kale's heart sank. He had a feeling his life was about to get a lot more complicated. The bond of survival. The sound of distant engines echoed through the ruins, a grim reminder that the raiders were still out there. Kale and Leora moved quickly, weaving through the debris with the children in tow. The little ones clung to Leora, their small hands gripping her cloak tightly. Their wide, amber eyes darted around, filled with fear and confusion. Kale couldn't blame them. The galaxy was a harsh place, and it had been especially cruel to them. "We need to get out of here," Kale said, his voice low but urgent. "They'll be back, and next time, they'll bring more." Leora nodded, her expression grim. "There's an old transport hub not far from here. If we can reach it, we might be able to find a ship." Kale frowned. "Might?" Leora's golden eyes met his, filled with determination. "It's our only chance." Kale didn't argue. He knew better than to question someone who had survived as long as Leora clearly had. He adjusted his grip on his rifle and gestured for her to lead the way. "After you." They moved through the ruins, their footsteps quick but careful. The settlement was a maze of shattered buildings and collapsed structures, the air thick with the scent of smoke and decay. Kale kept his senses sharp, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The raiders were relentless, and he knew they wouldn't give up easily. As they walked, Leora glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Why did you help us?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with curiosity. Kale hesitated, his mind racing. Why had he helped them? He wasn't sure himself. Maybe it was the sight of the children, so small and vulnerable. Maybe it was the way Leora had stood her ground, unarmed but unyielding. Or maybe it was something deeper, something he couldn't quite put into words. "I couldn't just walk away," he said finally, his voice steady. "Not when I could do something." Leora studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you. You didn't have to, but, thank you." Kale didn't respond. He didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to gratitude. Survival in this galaxy was a solitary affair, and kindness was a luxury few could afford. But something about Leora and the children made him want to be better, to do better. The transport hub was in even worse shape than the settlement. The once bustling center of commerce and travel was now a crumbling shell of its former self, its walls scorched and its windows shattered. The few ships that remained were either destroyed or in no condition to fly. Kale's heart sank as he surveyed the damage. "This is it?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Leora nodded, her expression grim. "It's all we have." Kale sighed, running a hand through his hair. "All right. Let's see what we can find." They split up, searching the hub for anything that might be salvageable. Kale's hopes weren't high, but he knew they didn't have a choice. They couldn't stay here, and they couldn't go back. The raiders would be hunting them, and they needed to put as much distance between themselves and the settlement as possible. After what felt like hours, Leora called out to him. "Kale! Over here!" Kale hurried to her side, his heart pounding. She was standing in front of a small, battered ship, its hull dented and scorched but otherwise intact. It wasn't much, but it was their best chance. "Think it'll fly?" Kale asked, his voice filled with hope. Leora nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "It's old, but it should work. We'll need to make some repairs, but, it's something." Kale felt a flicker of relief. "All right. Let's get to work." The repairs took longer than Kale would have liked, but they didn't have a choice. The ship was their only way out, and they couldn't afford to cut corners. Leora proved to be surprisingly skilled with machinery, her hands moving swiftly and confidently as she worked on the ship's systems. Kale did what he could, following her instructions and lending a hand where needed. As they worked, the children watched from a safe distance, their eyes wide with curiosity. Kale couldn't help but smile at them. They were so young, so innocent. They didn't deserve any of this. None of them did. What are their names? Kale asked, nodding toward the children. Leora glanced at them, her expression softening. The boy is Terran. The girl is Mira. They're all I have left. Kale's heart ached at the pain in her voice. He didn't know what had happened to her, what she had lost, but he could see the weight of it in her eyes. It was a weight he knew all too well. We'll get them out of here, he said, his voice firm. I promise. Leora looked at him, her golden eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, Kale. For everything. Kale nodded, his resolve hardening. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain, he wasn't going to let Leora and the children down. Not now, not ever. The hidden truth. The ship's engines roared to life, their hum a welcome sound after hours of grueling repairs. Kale sat in the pilot's seat, his hands steady on the controls as he guided the ship out of the transport hub. Leora sat beside him, her golden eyes fixed on the viewport. The children, Terran and Mira, were strapped into the seats behind them, their small faces filled with a mixture of fear and excitement. Where are we going? Kale asked, his voice low but filled with curiosity. Leora hesitated, her fingers brushing against the glowing pendant around her neck. There's a place, a hidden outpost. It's where my people used to gather. If we can reach it, we might be able to find help. Kale frowned. Your people. Leora nodded, her expression grim. I'm not just a captive, Kale. I was a guardian. My people, the Zanari, were protectors of an ancient technology. The Raiders, they want it. And they'll stop at nothing to get it. Kale's heart sank. He had a feeling this was bigger than he had imagined. This technology, what is it? Leora's golden eyes met his, filled with a mixture of fear and determination. It's called the Shard of Ilarion. It's a source of immense power, capable of reshaping worlds. But it's also incredibly dangerous. In the wrong hands, it could destroy everything. Kale's mind raced as he tried to process what she was saying. And the Raiders, they know about it? Leora nodded. They've been hunting me for months. They think I can lead them to it. But I won't. I can't. Kale's grip tightened on the controls. So what's the plan? We can't just keep running forever. Leora's expression softened. We need to reach the outpost. There are others there, others who can help us. But it won't be easy. The Raiders will be watching. Kale nodded, his resolve hardening. Then we'll have to be careful. The journey to the outpost was tense, the ship's sensors constantly scanning for any sign of pursuit. Kale's hands were steady on the controls, his eyes fixed on the navigation screen. Leora sat beside him, her golden eyes scanning the stars. The children were quiet, their small faces filled with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. How much farther? Kale asked, his voice low. Not far, Leora replied, her voice steady. Just a few more jumps. Kale nodded, his mind racing. He didn't know what they would find at the outpost, but he knew one thing for certain, they couldn't afford to fail. As they approached the outpost, the ship's sensors picked up signs of life. There are people here, Kale said, his voice filled with relief. Leora's expression softened. My people. They've survived. The outpost came into view, a massive structure hidden within the heart of a nebula. Its surface was covered in ancient carvings that glowed faintly, a testament to the advanced technology of the Zanari. As they approached, the ship's sensors picked up signs of movement. They're here, Leora said, her voice filled with anticipation. Kale guided the ship into the docking bay, his hands steady on the controls. The moment the hatch opened, Leora was on her feet, her movements quick and purposeful. Kale followed close behind, his hand resting on the weapon at his side. The outpost was eerily quiet, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. The walls were lined with ancient consoles, their screens flickering with faint light. As they moved deeper into the outpost, they were met by a group of Leora's people, tall, elegant beings with skin that shimmered like starlight. "Leora," one of them said, his voice filled with relief. "You've returned." Leora nodded, her expression grim. "I have. But we don't have much time. The enemy is close." The leader of the group, an elder with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, stepped forward. "We've been waiting for you. The shard, do you have it?" Leora reached for the pendant around her neck, holding it up for all to see. The shard of Ilarion pulsed with a faint, otherworldly light, its energy filling the room. The elder's eyes widened. "At last. With this, we can rebuild." "We can." "No," Leora interrupted, her voice firm. "The shard is too dangerous. If it falls into the wrong hands, it could destroy everything. We need to find another way." The elder's expression darkened. "There is no other way. The shard is our only hope." Kale stepped forward, his presence commanding. "Leora's right. We can't risk it. There has to be another solution." The elder studied Kale for a moment, then sighed. "Very well. But we must act quickly. The enemy will not wait." The chase through the stars. The outpost was a maze of corridors and chambers, each one filled with ancient technology and artifacts. Kale and Leora moved quickly, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The shard's light guided them, its energy growing stronger as they approached the heart of the outpost. "This is it," Leora said, stopping before a massive door covered in intricate carvings. "The vault. The shard's power source is inside." Kale nodded, his hand resting on the door. "Let's hope it's still intact." The door slid open with a hiss, revealing a chamber filled with glowing crystals and ancient machinery. In the center of the room was a pedestal, its surface covered in the same carvings as the shard. Leora stepped forward, placing the shard on the pedestal. The room was filled with a blinding light as the shard's power was unleashed. "It's working," Leora said, her voice filled with awe. "The shard is activating the outpost's systems." But before she could say more, the outpost shook violently, the sound of explosions echoing through the halls. Kale's heart sank as he realized what was happening. "They're here," he said, his voice tense. "We need to move." Leora nodded, her expression grim. "We can't let them get the shard. No matter what." The enemy's forces were closing in, their footsteps echoing through the outpost's corridors. Kale and Leora stood at the entrance to the vault, their backs against the wall as they waited for the shard's energy to reach its peak. "Any second now," Leora whispered, her golden eyes fixed on the shard. Kale's heart pounded as the sound of footsteps grew louder. Then, with a deafening roar, the shard's energy was unleashed. A blinding wave of light swept through the outpost, its force knocking the enemy's forces off their feet. The outpost shook violently, the sound of explosions filling the air. "Now," Leora shouted, grabbing Kale's hand and pulling him toward the exit. They sprinted through the outpost's corridors, the shard's energy still pulsing around them. The enemy's forces were in disarray, their ships disabled by the shard's power. Kale and Leora reached the docking bay just as the outpost systems began to fail. "We need to go," Kale said, his voice urgent. "The outpost's going to collapse." Leora nodded, her expression grim. "Let's move." They boarded the ship, the engines roaring to life as they prepared to take off. The outpost shook violently, its structure beginning to collapse as the shard's energy destabilized. "Hold on," Kale shouted, steering the ship out of the docking bay just as the outpost exploded in a burst of light. The ship was thrown forward by the force of the explosion, its shields barely holding. Kale's hands were steady on the controls as he guided the ship through the debris, his heart pounding in his chest. "We made it," Leora said, her voice filled with relief. Kale nodded, his expression grim. For now. But they'll be back. And next time, they won't stop until they have the shard. Leora looked at him, her golden eyes filled with determination. Then we'll be ready. Together.